War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 68, the Battle of Tours. Having laid down the somewhat mythical origins of the early Islamic Empire, but noting their very real successes, we do at least owe a cursory overlook of the Franks, from whom much of Western civilization stems. While famous for being the rulers of Gaul, aka France, since the 5th century AD, they are of Germanic origin. The Celtic Gauls, who ruled their eponymous land since at least the 5th century BC, were defeated by Julius Caesar and gradually became Romanized, losing their cultural identity. And as the Roman Empire crumbled, these Romanesque were replaced by the distinct Franks from the north. Famously ferocious, the Franks conquered all but the southernmost part of France, bordering Spain, known as Aquitaine, and they too retained a Roman-descended leadership. While we would generally consider the region Gaul, at the time of the fall of Rome, borrowing from the Roman word for the region, naturally the Franks had their own term, Francia, meaning land of the Franks. Charles's father, Pepin, was born in Herstal, now in Belgium, showing that modern borders do not match neatly the historical record. It isn't just the colonized world that apparently suffers from mismatched borders in history. Pepin, unencumbered by such norms as monogamy, had 4 male children from 3 women, one of whom was Plectrude, who was technically his wife. Despite her best efforts to exclude Charles from the throne in favor of her grandchildren who, due to their age, would be incapable of ruling, and therefore giving de facto control to Plectrude herself, Charles eventually gained the throne through no small effort. Plectrude had him imprisoned immediately upon Pepin's death in Cologne, now located in Germany. A civil war broke out between the Neustrians, located in today's northern France, set in around Paris, but considered the southern part of Francia, and the Austrasians, located in the northeast of the Frankish realm, where Plectrude's grandson, Theodoald, nominally reigned. These two factions clashed at the Battle of Compiègne, where the Austrasians lost and fled the field, retreating back to Cologne, which was soon invaded by local lords who freed Charles, and he then gained control of the Austrasians' army. The Neustrians and Austrasians battled in Cologne, where Charles failed to defend the city and much of the treasury was given to the besieged capital. This was the first battle of Charles's career and his only true defeat. Charles retreated to the Eifel Mountains and gathered Austrasian men who refused to acknowledge the Neustrian kingship, and then surprised King Chilperic near Malmedy in the Battle of Blève. He attacked them while they were resting, and then, apparently, feigned a retreat, leading the pursuing Neustrians into an ambush, where he destroyed much of the enemy's forces and fractured the alliance between the Frisians to the north and Neustrians from the south. This win caused others to rally to Charles's cause, and he gathered enough forces to invade Neustria near Cambrai and defeated them at the Battle of Inchy, which forced Chilperic to again retreat all the way to Paris. Having lost his northern Frisian allies, Chilperic allied with Duke Odo of Aquitaine to his south, and marched on Charles's forces near Soissons, pardon my French pronunciation, where they attacked the entrenched Austrasians and were defeated for the last time. At this, Chilperic retreated with Odo, who, showing a good political and military mind, surrendered Chilperic to Charles. Charles magnanimously allowed Chilperic to retain his title of King of the Franks, provided he acknowledged Charles as mayor over all the kingdoms and de facto leader. This allowed him to unite both Neustrians and Austrasians into one powerful Frankish army and ended the Frankish Civil War. His military skill was more than equaled by his diplomatic. Charles took on the Saxons, who had invaded the north and crushed them in the Teutoburg forest. Ragenfried, who fought with Childeric as mayor of Paris and many considered the true leader of the Neustrians, rebelled and was easily crushed, forced to give up his sons as hostage to ensure his allegiance to Charles. Charles then invaded Bavaria, forcing the Bavarians and Alemanni into allegiance and thus secured southern Germany for the growing Frankish Empire. Duke Odo, to the south, had for 10 years been left alone, but Charles was not to be stopped, and he invaded and looted several towns in Aquitaine. Duke Odo called upon the Arabs in Spain for assistance, despite the constant raids by Arab armies into Aquitaine and Duke Odo's own victory against them in the Battle of Toulouse in 721, where he broke a Muslim siege, finding his enemies slack in the defense and slaughtered them. Many have argued, and I somewhat concur, that this was the greater defeat of the Spanish Muslims than the Battle of Tours, as it was their first check against the Arabs in their march north. It was rather the reputation of Charles as Frankish ruler that gave greater weight to his victory at Tours. The fact that this earlier Muslim army appeared to be heavy with engineers and infantry, as opposed to cavalry, gives some more weight to this theory. That is an army designed to conquer and rule, not necessarily raid and pillage. Both sides have been credited with 300,000 troops fighting, which is almost certainly an order of magnitude too high. The fact is, neither side has any meaningful records of the battle itself. But Odo's great victory against the Muslims did not stop him from asking for their help against Charles in 732. But the Muslims saw this request as weakness and fell upon Aquitaine and Odo's forces. Odo met the invading Muslims, led by Abd al-Rahman, at Bordeaux, where Odo was defeated in the Battle of Garonne, but managed to escape with some of his men. Odo's duchy in Aquitaine was about to be lost, and he asked Charles for help. Charles agreed, with the caveat that Odo give full allegiance to Charles and openly recognize Charles as his leader. The Muslims, pillaging and marauding, gave time for Charles' forces to consolidate with Odo's. This time, the Muslim forces were mostly cavalry, and Odo's poorly trained and equipped infantry could not withstand the charges. Having easily defeated Odo at Burgundy and Garonne, the Muslims were highly confident. The battle itself is known as both the Battle of Poitiers, where the actual battlefield was apparently closer to, the true location remains unknown, and the Battle of Tours, which was apparently the objective of the Muslim army. The Abbey of St. Martin, located in Tours, was apparently the most important shrine in Western Christendom, and thus would have been rich with gold and treasure. Charles, from the north, advanced avoiding Roman roads and thus Muslim scouts, and set up a blocking position on the main road to Tours. Charles prepared defenses using the terrain of hills and woods to try and break up any cavalry charges. The Muslim forces were unsure how to proceed. Rahman wisely stopped and used the time to gather up his forces who had been pillaging the countryside. But the terrain masked Charles's true strength and, Charles's army, unlike Odo's, had over a decade of constant fighting experience. These were disciplined, hardened men. It is unknown how familiar Abd-al-Rahman was with Charles's exploits to the north and east. Charles gambled that the lure of riches of Tours would force the Muslims to attack versus maneuver around. Rahman could not afford to have such a large army in his rear while he attacked a defended and walled city. Uniquely for the age, much of Charles's army was professional and paid, and part of this money was paid for by the Pope to battle the Muslims. Rahman, while having the complete maneuver advantage, was further forced into action by the approaching winter. It was October, and the Muslims were dressed for a summer of marauding. Time was running out if they wanted to take Tours. After a week of fruitless probing attacks, Rahman decided to trust to his victorious and experienced cavalry who charged the Frankish lines. Time and again, the Saracens, itself a Greek word meaning Eastern and inferring Arab, charged, and apparently some breakthroughs, but the Frankish infantry never broke, and they ultimately slaughtered the cavalry and killed Rahman. The Muslim camp laid exposed, but, with night falling, Charles retreated to his lines and scouted the Muslim camp in the morning, finding the camp fully intact but deserted, the surviving cavalry having fled south during the night, abandoning their baggage and months of captured booty. As far as the argument whether Toulouse or Tours was more critical, the army of Abd-al-Rahman certainly penetrated farther north, and, had they defeated Charles's army, there remained no force capable of defending against the Muslims. However, unlike Toulouse, I don't think al-Rahman had any intent of conquering and staying. Rather, this was a raid for slaves and treasure. And, with approaching winter, he would have been incapable of holding together his forces much longer, and in the face of a Gallic winter. Had al-Rahman not bothered with pillaging the Gascony and Aquitaine countryside and marched directly north, this would have been a more serious long-term threat. And this victory at Tours did not stop all such Islamic invasions. Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj invaded Gaul yet again 3 years later, in 735, occupied Provence, and raiding Lyon, Burgundy, and Piedmont. Charles responded in 736 through 739 with mixed results. He destroyed the Muslim garrison at Avignon in 737, burning the city to the ground after its capture, and then moved on to Narbonne, defeating the Muslims at the Battle of the River Ber, but incapable of laying siege, so he left the garrison alone. It was only after Charles allied with the Lombards of northern Italy did the Muslims retreat, with the Battle of Zab 10 years later dividing the Islamic world into the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, with the bulk of the empire, and a severely weakened Umayyad holding onto Spain alone. So, from a military perspective, the Battle of Tours was not decisive and hardly even significant. So why has its name reverberated in the canyons of history? One is the person of Charles Martel. Martel literally translates to hammer, and hence his famous sobriquet. Had Charles fallen in battle, there would be no Charlemagne, no Holy Roman Empire, no Papal States. While I doubt the raiding force under Rahman would have continued past Tours, depending on the level of defeat, a follow-on force of more occupation-minded infantrymen may have followed. It was as much the personages of Charles as it was the victory itself which gave its importance. From the Muslim perspective, the failed siege of Constantinople the previous decade was far more important and disastrous. That said, the combined defeats at the hand of Charles did spell the end of the jihad in the West. Islam as an invading force culminated in the strategic sense. It was less the hammer of Charles Martel and more the anvil of his forces, which stopped the Muslim conquest and ensured a Christian future for Europe. Also, until this time, Spain's economy was entirely based upon booty seized in raids to the north. This was likewise ended by Charles's Franks. So Tours was decisive inter alia with the steadfast defense he showed the following decade, to include battles fought by his sons. And the inability of the Ummayyids to continue the jihad either in France or Constantinople certainly led to the fracture of the Ummah and the rise of the Abbasids. If greatness is to be ascribed, it is not to one battle, brilliantly planned and fought, but to the man who fought it in many other battles. And while his grandson would so rightly earn the title of Charles the Great, Charles Martel would, in many ways, be equally deserving of this title. Some trivial points I'd like to share in closing. Charles would have probably been known as Karl, Carlo, or Carolus during this time. So famous the name of Charles and his grandson, the Slavs took it and made it their word for king, Korol, and its Polish derivative, Kral. Beyond the military scope of this podcast, while the battle itself has a little of note, save disciplined infantry in the right terrain can withstand and defeat cavalry, the battle has become a symbol of Christendom versus Islam, of West versus East, and therefore a noteworthy battle, even if the tactics themselves were of little note. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.